This is the Runit Dome. It was built between 1977 and 1980 right on top of an old Cold War nuclear blast site. Basically, they just covered everything up with a giant concrete lid, and for a few decades everything stayed quiet, until the dome started to crack. It's reminding everyone of itself again, and it looks alarming. Because under that concrete slab, there isn't just a hole in the ground, it's much more serious. People living nearby are afraid that one day the dome won't hold. And some scientists openly say this is a disaster waiting to happen. So what actually happens at nuclear blast sites? Let's figure out what's inside and why everything went off track. There's something living in that pit. An unobtrusive reminder to do that thing under the video. So today, the Runit Dome poses a threat to the people living in the Marshall Islands. Even after the nuclear tests, residents were moved to the southern part of Eniwetok Atoll, farther from the blast sites. But the place never really became safe. The concrete dome is aging. In the summer of 2020, the media exploded with headlines about a nuclear coffin leaking radioactive waste straight into the Pacific Ocean. And unfortunately, that wasn't just fear-mongering. The area has stayed a zone of increased radioactivity for more than half a century, and scientists have long known that the dome is leaking. When researchers visited it in 2015, they took groundwater samples and found an exchange between the lagoon water and the material beneath the dome. In other words, radioactive particles are seeping out. Around the edges of the dome, where the concrete has started to crack, salty puddles gather, and underground mud saturated with radiation is already slowly oozing out of the crater. According to a 2013 report from the U.S. Department of Energy, the soil around the dome is even dirtier than what's stored inside it. But to understand what kind of danger Runit Dome poses today, we first need to look back at how it ended up there in the first place. If you approach this island from the lagoon side, which, by the way, is the second largest lagoon in the world, the concrete structure is almost invisible. It blends into the sparse, crooked trees. Now, decades after Americans left, the shore is littered with abandoned bunkers, old electrical cables, and black insulation snake across the sand. On the beaches, not a single warning. No signs, no radiation markers, nothing. The story of the Runit Dome began back in the 1940s, when the U.S. chose the Marshall Islands as a convenient site for testing nuclear weapons. Why here? Simple. Few people, far from major countries and shipping routes. The Marshall Islands are a tiny island state in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, roughly between Hawaii and the Philippines. In 1946, the U.S. dropped its first nuclear bomb on these islands, then 8 more over the next 5 years. Their yield ranged from 23 to 225 kilotons. All of this happened near the Eniwetok and Bikini Atolls. Then a new phase began. In 1952, the U.S. moved on to testing more powerful weapons, hydrogen bombs. Over the next 4 years, they carried out 25 explosions. Among them was the legendary Castle Bravo, a bomb 1,000 times more powerful than the one that destroyed Hiroshima. It's still the most powerful device the U.S. has ever detonated. By the late 1950s, the blasts became more frequent. The Americans were racing the clock before the ban on above-ground tests took effect, and starting in 1968, they began testing biological weapons on the islands as well. Dozens of different kinds. Then by the 1970s, the U.S. no longer needed these tests, but they left behind a devastated landscape. Massive craters, vanished islands, and tons of radioactive waste. Something had to be done with it. In 1972, the United States agreed to return the atoll to the local people after they threatened to sue. The Americans promised to clean the islands from the aftermath of the tests, but it turned out to be anything but easy. The atoll held around 3.1 million cubic feet of radioactive waste, roughly the volume of 35 Olympic-sized pools, only filled not with water but with contaminated soil and debris. The island of Runit suffered the most. 11 nuclear explosions were conducted here, leaving powerful radiation underground. To put it in perspective, the half-life of some isotopes here is 24,000 years, meaning for humans this island will be dangerous forever. So the Atomic Energy Commission, which later became part of the Department of Energy, teamed up with the military and came up with a plan. All the radioactive waste from the entire Eniwetok Atoll would be collected and dumped into one crater on Runit Island. After that, they'd just cover the whole thing with concrete. And that's how the Runit Dome was born. Private companies didn't want to take on a job like this, and Congress refused to pay for it, so the soldiers did everything themselves. From 1977 to 1980, about 4,000 American servicemen manually scraped up contaminated soil and debris, hauled it all to the crater, and poured concrete over it. In the end, they built a concrete structure 377 feet across with walls about 18 inches thick. By the way, the crater they filled had formed 20 years earlier after a nuclear explosion codenamed Cactus. Its yield was 18 kilotons, almost the same as the bomb dropped on Nagasaki. Building this concrete sarcophagus took nearly 3 years and about $250 million. The result was a giant dome with an area of almost 100,000 square feet, covered on top with 358 huge concrete slabs. Sure, there were supposed to be safety protocols, but almost all of them were dropped right away. The heat on the atoll was so unbearable that people simply couldn't work in yellow hazmat suits. Devices meant to measure the level of plutonium in the air quickly broke down, and there weren't enough respirators for everyone. Supervisors just said, "Wrap t-shirts around your faces." An outstanding level of safety. Plutonium dust settled everywhere. Paul Laird, a bulldozer driver who worked on the Runit Dome, later recalled that the dust felt like baby powder. Soft, sticky, absolutely everywhere. People were covered in it, head to toe. When construction ended, the bulldozer was pushed into the ocean. It had absorbed so much radiation that no one wanted to touch it. Paul later wondered how, if the machine got such a dose, he managed to survive at all. Sadly, Paul and hundreds of other servicemen who worked on the dome later fell ill. Many developed cancer, and others had severe bone and organ problems. But let's get back to current problems. The Runit Dome is falling apart from the inside, and the main reason is water. When Washington allocated money to build the dome, it was originally meant to be a temporary storage site. The plan was to pour concrete not only over the top, but also over the bottom of the crater so nothing could leak out. But then they decided it was too expensive. As a result, the lower part of the dome is just bare ground left after the nuclear blast. The soil there is loose, lets water through, and has no special protection. Because of that, seawater now freely seeps into the dome. Why didn't anybody do anything in 2015 when it became clear the dome was leaking? Because scientists said back then, yes, radiation is leaking, but only a little. According to their data, the amount of plutonium under the dome is only about 1% of what is already settled in the surrounding lagoons. And that's less than 0.1% of the total release during all nuclear tests. And technically, these numbers still fall within the limits set by U.S. and international water quality standards. Even so, experts point out that the area remains dangerous. Recent studies by Columbia University showed that radiation levels differ a lot from island to island, and on the neighboring atolls of Bikini and Rongelap, they turned out to be noticeably higher. In general, as long as the plutonium stays under the Runit Dome, it doesn't seem to pose a major threat to the Pacific. But it all depends on what happens next, how much the sea level rises, how often storms hit this place, and how strongly the tides flood the dome and wash water in and out of it. Sea level rise has already made itself felt. When the dome was first built, it stood about 25 feet above the water. Now the sea has risen, and during high tides, the waves already reach its base, eroding the concrete edges. The damage has been patched, but it's only a temporary fix. Water will still seep through and slowly break the concrete down. If sea level rise continues at the same pace, by the end of the century, the Runit Dome will end up underwater, at least partially. As for the locals, they try not to go near this island. Many are scared of radiation and stick to the official ban on visiting Runit. Today, only 3 islands on Eniwetak's narrow edge are considered safe to live on. But after the nuclear tests, life here changed completely, and the people who once fished and grew their own food now live in a place where the water is contaminated. The U.S. Department of Energy even banned the export of fish and dried coconut meat from Eniwetak Atoll because of high contamination levels. Now, almost all food is brought in by barges. The islanders rely on imported canned goods and processed products. Sometimes they still go to Runit, not for fish, but for metal. They pick up copper scrap left behind by the Americans and sell it to Chinese traders for a few dollars. But does something terrible always happen at the site of a nuclear blast afterward? Apparently not always. Since 1945, at least 8 countries have carried out more than 2,000 nuclear tests. That means there are hundreds of craters on Earth left behind by those explosions. Some were formed when bombs tore open the surface, others when they were detonated underground and the ground simply collapsed. But are they dangerous now? And if they are, why does almost no one talk about it? Let's head over to the U.S., to the state of Nevada. That's where the largest nuclear crater in North America is located, and one of the biggest in the world. It's called the Sedan Crater and sits about 90 miles north of Las Vegas. When the bomb went off here, the ground basically turned inside out. The result was a pit about 330 feet deep and nearly 1,300 feet across, and of course the place made history. 7 months after the blast, radiation levels in the crater had dropped so much that you could safely walk along the bottom without protective suits. Today, more than 10,000 tourists come here every year on free tours run by the U.S. Department of Energy. There's even a viewing platform at the rim that gives you a full view of the floor below. Grass is growing there again, and the landscape doesn't look nearly as dead as it once did. But the fact that it's now safe to stroll around doesn't mean much. When this crater appeared, it caused enormous damage. At the moment of the explosion, the radiation fallout covered more than 13 million people. And to understand how that happened, we need to go back in time. Nuclear energy wasn't originally meant only for weapons or fuel. At the dawn of the nuclear age, scientists wanted to understand whether this power could be used for peaceful purposes. For example, in industry. Our explosion was part of a program with the poetic name Plowshare, a nod to the plow turning the soil. The idea sounded almost poetic. Harness the destructive force of the atom for good to build canals and roads, mine resources, or simply move huge amounts of earth in no time. On paper, it looked perfect. In practice, not quite. In 1962, engineers drilled a shaft about 590 feet deep in the desert and lowered a bomb called Sedan into it. Its yield was 104 kilotons, roughly 6 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. When the charge went off, the ground above it swelled into a dome almost 330 feet high and then burst open. A massive plume of dirt and dust, around 12 million tons, shot out of the epicenter. All of it rose into the air and was carried by the wind for hundreds of miles. According to some reports, this very explosion exposed more Americans to radiation than any other nuclear test ever conducted in the U.S. After that, it became painfully clear the idea of peaceful atomic blasts doesn't mix well with reality. And when the movie about the creation of the first nuclear bomb hit theaters in the summer of 2023, it wasn't just another premiere for many people. For those living near the former test sites where the explosions were carried out, it was a painful reminder. They had only 1 year left to file a claim for government compensation for the illnesses they believe came from those very blasts. A $50,000 check is small comfort, especially considering that many were diagnosed with thyroid or lung cancer, typical consequences of radiation exposure. But how could anyone even come up with the idea of detonating nuclear bombs in the middle of a densely populated country? The Sedan nuclear crater is located at the Nevada test site. This place appeared in 1951 at the height of the Cold War. Back then, the U.S. was developing a new generation of nuclear bombs and needed a place to test them. The site was used for testing warheads designed at the Los Alamos Laboratory in New Mexico and the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory in California. Over the years, more than 1,000 nuclear tests were carried out in Nevada, most of them underground. Declassified satellite images from 1965 show the whole area literally riddled with craters, and the biggest one is Sedan. And this is what the area looked like in 1952. Why did they choose this region? Simple. The territory southwest of Tonopah and all the way to the northern edge of Las Vegas was considered remote enough and, most importantly, easy to control from a safety standpoint. Previous tests in the Pacific drew too much attention from other countries, while here they could work quietly. When the test site was first created, about 47,000 people lived in Clark County and fewer than 10,000 lived in the neighboring counties of Nye, White Pine, Eureka, Lander, and Lincoln. Today, Clark County alone has around 2.3 million residents. Darwin Morgan from the National Atomic Testing Museum in Las Vegas explained, where the radioactive clouds went, the population was less than a person per square mile. But even so, the test still affected tens of thousands of people. Estimates say around 56,000 people living nearby experienced the consequences. This includes people who lost family members to cancers, one of the 20 types officially recognized as linked to radiation exposure, and members of the strange atomic pop culture in Las Vegas. They held rooftop parties to watch the flashes of nuclear blasts and even sold atomic cocktails. And this is what a satellite image taken in 2018 looks like. The same crater-scarred desert that resembles the moon more than the Earth. Nothing much has changed. Today, anyone can open a map and zoom in on the old test sites. After more than 900 nuclear tests carried out in Nevada in the 1950s and 1960s, people began to realize they had become part of an experiment no one had warned them about. Radioactive fallout blanketed entire towns, and many learned about it only years later when they started getting sick. One eyewitness recalled, "We heard the countdown on the radio. Half a minute later, the ground would start shaking and waves would literally roll across the desert." Nobody thought about what would come next. What would happen to the water sources, to the animals, to us? Locals watched huge clouds rising on the horizon, and then, sadly, cancer appeared. First among acquaintances, then neighbors, then relatives. When lawsuits began piling up one after another, Congress introduced a bill in 1989, the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. Senator Ted Kennedy introduced it to at least somehow compensate people for the harm they suffered from radiation. In Nevada, these people were called downwinders, from the words downwind side. These were the ones who lived in Nye, White Pine, Eureka, Lander, and Lincoln counties, as well as in the northeast part of Clark County during the years when atmospheric tests were conducted from 1951 to 1963. Similar communities appeared in Arizona and Utah. Even so, researchers note that people in Nevada received lower radiation doses than those affected after Chernobyl, and scientific data also confirms that the people who suffer the most are those who breathed the air during the fallout. Alpha radiation particles enter the lungs and then settle in the thyroid gland. It's especially dangerous to be within 18 miles downwind of the epicenter. That's where most of the radioactive dust settles. Overall, this is yet another example of what happens to craters and their surroundings right after an explosion and many years later. And this applies not only to land, there are underwater nuclear craters on the planet as well. Now let's head back to the Pacific, to Bikini Atoll. Just 3 miles off the coast, at a depth of about 197 feet, lies the aircraft carrier Saratoga. Once the pride of the U.S. Navy, it's now one of the casualties of a nuclear blast. The ship stands on the seabed, its mast almost touching the surface. 3 Helldiver planes and an Avenger torpedo bomber are still parked on the deck. Nearby lie unexploded bombs, and the anti-aircraft guns are still pointed at the sky. A little farther away rests the former flagship of the Japanese fleet, the battleship Nagato. This was the ship where the Pearl Harbor attack was planned. These are just 2 of the 10 sunken ships and several smaller vessels destroyed during the nuclear tests codenamed Able and Baker. All of this is what remains of Operation Crossroads. Operation Crossroads took place in the summer of 1946. It was a series of the first atmospheric nuclear tests in history, carried out at Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands. They planned 3 detonations, but only conducted 2, one in the air and one in shallow water. Each device had a yield of about 21 kilotons. The goal wasn't just to break everything. Scientists in the military wanted to understand how a nuclear blast affects ships, equipment, and materials. Basically, it was a test of how well the fleet could survive a nuclear war, and since the results could seriously affect military budgets, both the U.S. Navy and the Air Force followed every stage closely. What made Operation Crossroads different from all later tests was the presence of journalists. The media were allowed to film and talk in detail about everything that was happening. All of it was meant to show Americans how honest and scientific these experiments were. The first test, codenamed Able, was carried out on July 1st. It was a plutonium bomb dropped from a B-29. The results turned out to be roughly the same as those of the bombs detonated at Trinity and Nagasaki. But the military had expected more. Able didn't deliver the effect they were hoping for. But the second test, Baker, was a completely different story. It was held on July 25th with the same type of bomb lowered underwater to a depth of about 88 feet. The explosion was massive. In an instant, thousands of tons of water shot into the air, and the waves that followed were so powerful that historians compare them to the tsunami caused by the Krakatoa eruption in 1883. The bomb's yield was about 21 kilotons, the same as Abel's, but the effect was far stronger. The Baker blast destroyed 74 ships anchored in the lagoon and left everyone stunned. One historian later wrote that this test restored respect for the power of the atomic bomb. That iconic photograph was later reprinted in newspapers worldwide and still stands as a symbol of the bomb today. And chances are you've seen it too. But along with it came a new danger: radiation. After the underwater blast, a thick radioactive fog rose and settled right on the fleet. The level of contamination turned out to be much higher than anyone had predicted. The ships became real radioactive furnaces. If people had been on board, they would have taken a lethal dose of radiation without even realizing it. The crews who tried to clean the vessels began to get exposed. The head of radiation safety, Dr. Stafford Warren, quickly realized things were going wrong. According to him, continuing the decontamination work posed a serious risk to the personnel. The operation was halted, and the third planned explosion, which they wanted to carry out at the bottom of the lagoon, was canceled entirely. In total, 5 craters formed in Bikini Lagoon during the tests, and the deepest of them, the Bravo crater, goes down almost 239 feet. The crater and the entire area around it have turned into a graveyard of warships. It's a whole ghost fleet left on the bottom of Bikini Lagoon. The ships brought here for Operation Crossroads represented 34 years of shipbuilding history, from the old battleship Arkansas, built back in 1912, to the newest vessel, ARDC-13, which was rushed to completion just a few months before the test. Most of these ships had served through World War II. They took part in major naval battles and operations. Some of them, like the destroyer USS Anderson, are unique. They're the only surviving representatives of their classes, even if they're now lying underwater. All of them were heavily damaged during the Operation Crossroads explosions. Metal cracked, decks bent, hulls were torn apart. And now all of this rusts in the quiet of the lagoon, a reminder of the price paid to usher in the atomic age. For instance, this illustration shows the damage to the plating on the ship Saratoga. And this image shows the actual positions of the sunken ships inside the crater and around it. But you know what's the most interesting part? Despite all the blasts, heat, and radiation, nature managed to survive. In Bikini Lagoon, where the water once boiled and ships were melting, scientists are now seeing the corals come back and the fish return. The atolls of the Marshall Islands stretch across about 965,000 square miles. They're some of the northernmost reefs in the Central Pacific Ocean. From 1946 to 1958, 23 nuclear tests were carried out here with a total yield of more than 76 megatons of TNT. They blew things up everywhere, on the reefs, in the sea, in the air, and underwater. After these tests, environmental scientists registered catastrophic changes. The surface water temperature during the blast shot up to 99,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The waves moved at 26 feet per second, and the shock surges rose 98 feet high, reaching all the way to the bottom of the lagoon, where the depth is around 229 feet. Coral fragments flew onto the decks of ships anchored several miles from the epicenter. The sediments on the seafloor were completely stirred up. The entire lagoon was covered with a thin layer of radioactive dust. The seawater became contaminated with decay products that kept rising back up from the bottom. As a result, 3 islands simply disappeared. Millions of tons of sand, coral, plants, and sea creatures were thrown into the air in a single blast. Sounds like total apocalypse. And that's why everyone thought nature would never recover. But it surprised everyone. Recently, a team of scientists traveled to the Marshall Islands to check what happened to the place where nuclear bombs were once detonated. They visited 4 remote atolls, including the legendary Bikini. The goal was simple: to see how much nature has managed to recover and compare it to the nearby Rongerak Atoll, which wasn't exposed to testing and serves as a clean reference point. These reefs are about as wild and untouched as anything can be today. The expedition was organized as part of the Pristine Seas Project. It's an international team of scientists, oceanographers, and filmmakers from the U.S. Over several months, they covered about 3,500 square miles, completed 645 dives, and collected terabytes of footage. And here's what they found. Bikini Atoll today is one of the best places in the entire Pacific for observing marine life. It's bursting with life. Tropical fish, reef sharks, corals. everything looks as if no explosions ever happened there at all. The researchers say this is a striking example of how the ocean can recover even after destruction on the scale of nuclear war. Today, about 72 square miles of reef are in excellent condition, and that's rare for the Pacific, where most reefs suffer from overheating and pollution. In the areas where blasts literally wiped the reef off the map, only sand and rubble remain, no longer a reef, just bare ground. But in other places where parts of the reef survived, life has returned. Where everything died in 1946 from heat and shock waves, corals are growing again. According to scientists, about 70% of the coral species that used to live on Bikini Atoll have returned over the past few decades. You owe me a like. See you later.